This tutorial is about hips, broad thighs, and the large buttocks. We will begin with broad hips. In this case, the hip joints are larger and wider than average. Fabric pulls around the fullest part of the hip. It's very easy to adjust. It's just a matter of adding more circumference. What you would do on the test garment is release the side seam in the area of the hips and allow the fabric to relax until the horizontal tension disappears. Then insert the required amount of fabric and update the pattern. We will adjust the back and the front equally at the side seam. I've established a pivot point where the waistline seam meets the side seam stitching line and another one along the side seam equally distant from the hip as the top pivot point. I'm now going to cut along my stitching line from top to lower pivot point. I will cut the seam allowance right at the full hip level. We are cut. I will now consult my test garment to see how much I need to add. We have added the required amount. I will now true my lines. Lines trued. This was such a tiny amount of truing. Remember to treat the front in exactly the same way as the back. This is the broad hip adjustment. Now let's look at the large thighs at the side adjustment. This is very similar to the broad hip adjustment. It's just done a little bit lower. In this situation, added weight resides on the sides of the body below the hip line, producing an outward curvature. Very taut horizontal wrinkles will emanate from the crotch toward the side at the thigh level. We simply need to add more circumference in this area. Again, you would release the side seam, allow the garment to relax so that all the tension is gone, insert fabric, and transfer that change to the pattern. Also, you would do this equally front and back. For the person I'm working with, the fullest part of the thigh was an inch below the crotch level, so I will mark that point. Also, according to the test garment, I will have pivot points 5 inches above and 5 inches below this area. That's where I'll be able to transition back to my original stitching line. I will now cut in at the level where the thighs are the largest and up and down to my pivot points. I've cut and inserted paper. Now I will consult my test garment. Here we are. Now we have room for the larger thighs at the side. The pants will be so much more comfortable. I do want to point out that it's really important to cut your line long enough so that you can gracefully transition back to the stitching line. This curve should be graceful. This is the updated pattern for large thighs at the side seam. Now let's talk about the large buttocks. I refer to this as the bootylicious adjustment. The large buttocks is quite easy to spot. It's very rounded, and the vertical distance from the waist to the crotch level needs to be lengthened. There will be tightness over the buttocks, and the pants will just be uncomfortable. Also, the center back is not up at the waist. It dips down very low sometimes. More vertical length is needed to cover the Great Divide. The adjustment I'm going to demonstrate, I do when all we really need at this point is more length. The thighs fit, the crotch curve fits. We just need more length to go all the way up to the waist. For my demo, I'm going to add 2¼ inches. I would never make one cutting line. and add 2 1/4 inches in any one place. I prefer to divide the addition up into smaller bits so that we can have a more graceful truing. I would begin by drafting my first cut line at right angles to grain, parallel to the full hip level and 5/8 of an inch above. I will establish a pivot point at the side seam. My first line has been drafted. I will now draft 2 more lines. I will space them an inch apart. My lines are drafted. I will cut each line to its respective pivot point. We are cut. I will now spread each of these 3/4 of an inch at the stitching line for a total of a 2 1/4 inch addition. We have our spread 3/4 of an inch in 3 places. This is one of those situations where it's extremely important to place the weights there and make sure everything is flat and accurate before you secure. Here is our additional length. We now have the length we need from the waist down to the crotch level to keep everything covered, but we do have some truing to do. The grain line below our adjustment is true, so we will just continue that up. For the center back, we will connect the curve at the full hip area with the waistline. We have our center back stitching line trued and the cutting line. But if you notice, we also managed to remove some fabric that we needed. What we'll do is add this back at the side. This part of the back is very flat. We don't need a seam that's curved outward to go over our center back. So I will measure the amount that we lobbed off, if you will, and add it to the side seam. Here's our new side seam stitching line and cutting line. This is what we've added because we did remove it here. This is the large buttocks or bootylicious adjustment.